Hello everyone and welcome back to Circus and Circuit, Unraveling Global Trade podcast. I'm your host Kate Foronda, and as 2025 New York Climate Week is over, I'm glad to be back so we could continue exploring the global space of trade together. You know, when I planned episodes at the beginning of the year, I was supposed to talk about coffee beans today. And it's remaining on my calendar, but still being under the Climate Week effect, I want to reflect on one very interesting topic: pollution. I touched on sustainability and global trade in episode 9, and it may sound like pollution could be covered there, but first, the subject itself, it's so comprehensive that the whole podcast could be devoted just to it, not a single episode. And second, I want to speak about pollution and so-called carbon credits not from legal or moral standpoints, but more from our trading perspective. And in fact, during Climate Week in New York, the conversation turned sharply toward how carbon credit must evolve. New initiative announced at Climate Week, the Carbon Data Open Protocol or CDOP, discussions on jurisdictional credit and demand for high integrity standards suggest we are at turning point. So today I'm tackling one of the strangest ideas in modern economics, the notion that pollution can be measured, priced, and traded like any other commodity. Pollution has become a market product, and whether you call it ingenious climate finance or greenwashing show, carbon credit now sit at the center of global trade and climate policy. Picture this: a coal plant in India releases a thick plume of smoke into the air. Thousands of miles away, in Brazil, rainforest stands untouched because the project promises to keep it that way. And in New York, a trader at his or her trade desk isn't looking at oil futures or soybean contracts. He or she is buying and selling something much stranger: the right to pollute. And I will repeat it: the right to pollute. Pollution, once seen only as toxic byproduct, has become a commodity. And as I said, it's measured, priced, and traded across borders like wheat, oil, or gold. And you may ask, how on earth did we get here? So let me tell you this. For decades, pollution was an externality, and it means that cost was pushed onto society. Industry had little incentive to stop because dumping waste into the air or water was free. Then came cap and trade. Instead of telling every company exactly how to cut emissions, government set a cap, a ceiling on how much pollution could be released. Permits were issued, each one allowing the holder to emit a fixed amount, often 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And if a company polluted less, it could sell the extra permits. If it polluted more, it had to buy them. And suddenly, permits had value. So what we have here? Scarce, measurable, and tradable. So DNA of a commodity market. Next came offsets. Imagine a project that captures methane from landfills, plants trees to absorb carbon, or installs solar panels to replace coal. Each ton of emissions reduced or avoided could be turned into a credit. That credit could then be sold to another company that wanted to offset its own footprint. And here's a simple analogy. Let's say you smoke cigarettes, and every time you lit a match, you need a coupon. Government issue only a fixed amount of coupons each year. If you quit smoking and don't use your match coupons, you can sell them to someone else who still smokes. That's basically how carbon credit work. And at first glance, it's ingenious. Pollution finally has a price. Companies that innovate can profit, and society as a whole gets cleaner air without endless lawsuits. But turning pollution into a tradable good also means it's subject to speculation, loopholes, and sometimes override fraud. And this is where the whole story takes its twist. Now that we know what credits are, let's talk about how the markets actually works. Carbon markets come in two main categories: compliance and voluntary. Compliance markets are created by law. Government set a cap, issue permits, and let companies trade. The European emission trading system, launched in 2005, is the largest. It covers about 40% of Europe's emission. For example, in USA, California runs a similar system, and China launched its national market in 2021. And by the way, now it's the world's biggest market by volume. In these systems, permits aren't optional. If you emit more than you are allowed, you face fines. That makes allowance valuable assets on balance sheets. Now let's talk about voluntary markets. And this market works differently. Here companies pledge climate goals, say to be carbon neutral by 2030. They first cut what they can, then buy credits to cover the rest. And these credits come from projects like reforestation in Kenya or methane capture in India. Independent standards like Verra or Gold Standard verify the projects. Credits generally fall into two categories: avoidance credits that prevent emissions, like protecting a forest, and removal credits actively take carbon out of the air, like planting trees or using direct air capture. Verification is supposed to ensure reductions are real, measurable, and additional, which means they wouldn't have happened anyway. But as well as we could see, that is not always the case. Prices vary widely, and for example, in European market, credits have traded over $100 per ton. In voluntary markets, you can buy credit for as little as like $2 or $3 per ton. And there's a gap, like a price gap, and it tells us something. Not all credits are equal. Around this has grown an entire ecosystem: brokers, auditors, traders, even hedge funds. Basically, everything that we have when we are trading physical commodities or contracts. ICE or CME trade carbon futures. Air Carbon Exchange in Singapore calls itself the Nasdaq for carbon. Financial firms package credit into portfolios, and some even tokenize them on blockchains. For example, JP Morgan is testing tokenization of carbon register, and is done in collaboration with S&P and other major players. It means these credits are being treated like digital securities. Tokenization doesn't automatically equal credibility in this case. And many critics know that low-quality credits, German project or double-counted credit, have been tokenized, and it caused volatility and trust issue. So on paper, carbon market look like any other commodity market: unit, exchanges, registers, futures, but as you might expect, the real world is far messy. Now let's talk about issues and even scandals. In 2023, The Guardian found that more than 90% of rainforest offsets certified by Verra were essentially worthless. Forest loss wasn't actually prevented, so the carbon savings existed only on paper. And yet companies like Shell or Disney used these credits to claim carbon neutrality. Another problem is double counting. Suppose a forest in Kenya generates credit. A European airline buys them. Meanwhile, the Kenyan government also counts that same forest toward its national climate pledge. 1 ton of carbon gets counted twice in this system, but our atmosphere doesn't care, right? Moving forward, there's also price gap. High quality credit in Europe, as we already know, could cost over $100. Voluntary credits often sells for less than $5, like $2-3. Cheaper credits are more likely to be low quality, such as renewable projects that would have happened anyway. Fraud also hit compliance market. And in early years of the EU ETS, some firms got too many free allowances, which they sold for huge profits without cutting emissions. Later, that fraud scheme cost governments billions of dollars as criminals exploited cross-border loopholes. Meanwhile, legitimate corporations also game the system. Oil majors proudly declare net zero while continuing business as usual, buying cheap credits to cover their drills. And that's called greenwashing. Looking climate friendly without real change. And this term became widely used. Global inequality is another circus act. Many carbon projects are in the south. Take Brazil's Acre state, where Standard Chartered signed a deal to sell forest credit to global clients. 72% of the money is supposed to flow to local and indigenous communities, but the carbon savings are ultimately booked in London, not in the Amazon. Another example is cookstove projects in Kenya and Uganda. In Kenya, for instance, programs distribute thousands of efficient stoves to rural households. Each stove might save about 1 to 3 tons CO2 per year. Multiple by number of years and number of those stoves, the project generate carbon credit to sell on the voluntary market. And there are many credits, right? So rural families change daily habits to cut firewood use, while airlines and luxury brands in the United States and Europe can advertise carbon neutral flights. And a few more examples here. For example, Shell has bought forestry credit in Peru to market net zero fuel, even as local NGOs question how much communities really had in the project. And Delta Airlines had promoted offsets, tried to forest protection in Liberia, despite warnings that there is little evidence the forests were truly at risk. And meanwhile, of many carbon projects are in global south, but buyers are mostly in global north. Rich companies keep emitting while poorest regions supply the offsets. Critics around the world call this carbon colonialism. And let's not forget speculation. Hedge funds treat carbon like any other assets, buying low, selling high, bundling credits into exotic products. And as I have already mentioned, crypto startups even try turning offsets into blockchain tokens. And even such big companies, banks like JP Morgan or S&P entered this space. But of course, there were bad or unsuccessful examples. And one of them was the Toucan Protocol, which converted old and often low-quality credit into digital tokens called base carbon tons, BCTs. At first, the market boomed, tied to a KlimaDAO project, but when it turned out that many of the credits were outdated or junk, confidence collapsed and tokens' value crashed. It has a reminder that carbon trading, once finalized, carries the same risks as any commodities market or speculative bubble. So if you have never heard about it, I encourage you to Google the names and read more. So, where do we go from here? Despite scandals, carbon credits aren't disappearing. and in fact they are expanding. I think if pollution is traded as a commodity, we can follow similar rules and look in the same directions in order to deal with it effectively. For example, as first, we can consider international policy. Under the Paris Agreement, Article 6 sets rules for countries to trade carbon reductions. If implemented well, it could standardize accounting and reduce double counting. But global consensus is tricky: who gets credit for what and how to enforce it. It's still a question, right? Then technology. New tools may clean up the market. Satellite monitoring and artificial intelligence can verify forest cover in real time. Blockchain register could make double selling impossible. Big data analytics can track methane flares or illegal logging with more precision than ever. Third, we could talk about corporate behavior. Investors increasingly demand hard evidence of climate progress, not just glossy reports. Regulations like European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will force companies to disclose emissions more strictly, and that could shrink the space for low-quality credit. But with all that, challenges still remains. Prices in voluntary markets are still too low to drive meaningful change, and many offset projects are short-term. Trees can burn, forests can be cut. And the ethical question persists. Should rich companies keep polluting as long as they buy enough credit elsewhere? Still, here's the potential. If credits are credible, and I really like this, credits are credible, they could channel billions of dollars into climate solution on the earth. Protecting forests, building renewables, restoring ecosystems, all that are funded by global trade. If it's done right, the market could be both profitable and planet-saving. So the real question is whether we can clean up the circus without dismantling the circuit. Because the world doesn't just need creative accounting, it needs real reductions. And in a fight against climate change, the difference between the two might decide how viable our future will be. This was episode 17, Carbon Credit Trading Pollution. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to share it with a colleague or friends who are curious about global trade. As always, thank you for joining me on Circus and Circuit Unraveling Global Trade podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed.